Thank you, Jerry. Thank you very much for the invitation. I also thank Chris, who I met a couple of years ago in Galway, and he encouraged me to follow this work, actually, and it's very nice to be here today. I'm going to be talking about second-tier high-tech regions in the United States. And I've looked at these regions in the context of the Silicon Valley myth, or sort of a story that we all know. We know this story. You need a world-class university like Stanford University. You need a mix of small and medium-sized enterprises network together, and you create this kind of innovative and entrepreneurial high-tech economy like Silicon Valley. What I'm trying to argue is actually there's a different model. There's a model of these second-tier high-tech regions, and maybe this model is actually a more relevant model. It's a model of spin-off processes and lead companies, anchor companies. And when I say this might be the normal model, we can take a look at Seattle. This is the Seattle high-tech economy, and it depicts the spin-off processes that are happening in this region. And you can see the yellow universe is Microsoft. Microsoft has had about 150 spin-offs that are orbiting around this anchor company. The rings are time rings, so if you get closer to the center of the universe, it's the older spin-offs, and the more out you get, it's the newer ones. You have spin-offs like Expedia. From Expedia, you have a couple of other web-based companies. We also have a universe up there that sort of purplish is the University of Washington. They had a couple of spin-offs, primarily following their reforms and technology transfer in the 1980s. We see Amazon, the pink in the lower bottom. Amazon hasn't had many spin-offs, and they only started to have entrepreneurship after they had profit share and they went public. So it's kind of an interesting situation where Amazon didn't have really, it was probably too exciting to work for Amazon. The profit share didn't kick in until later. We have Aldous, it's now Adobe. It's a local company, has had a few spin-offs. Then McCaw Cellular is the one, sort of the darker pink. That's a telecommunication company, it doesn't exist anymore. And we have Boeing, and this is only Boeing's software IT arm that has spin-offs. So it's a story of entrepreneurship. It's not a story of world-class universities, even though here in Seattle you have you have a good university that has had spin-offs. And this is also the story for Portland, Oregon, and Boise, Idaho, and Kansas City. I'm going to be talking about Portland and Boise today in the context of a debate that centers around two arguments. There's the argument that maybe the Silicon Valley literature has put forward, and Michael Porter, it's this cluster argument where high-tech economies emerge out of agglomeration benefits. But the other argument is this argument. It's the argument that you have spin-off processes that then create a cluster or sort of this agglomeration economy. And the Silicon Valley story is probably too simple. You know, it's like a recipe. You put a small network of these medium-sized enterprises, you have a world-class university, and you have large amounts of venture capital. That's the Saxenian story. But then there are many others that have added to it. Some have looked even further in history than the founding of Hewlett-Packard and the Stanford University story. They've looked at the radio and telegraph companies that emerged in 1909 and following years, and the spin-offs that were created in Silicon Valley. Others have looked at sort of the two phases of Silicon Valley. Yes, you have the small firms, but you also have large dominant market players. So you have a much more heterogeneous industry structure than what we think of Silicon Valley is. And you see also that the firms in Silicon Valley expanded outside of Silicon Valley already in the 50s. Hewlett-Packard went abroad. The expansions into Portland and Boise were sort of in that time frame, following in the 70s. And the other notion of this different story of Silicon Valley is that the university is not the engine of growth, it's actually a support institution. And that leads me to look what do we know about the emergence of high-tech regions. And there are probably three models that we can describe. There's the Silicon Valley model where, yes, the university has played an important role, and we see developments around that. It's probably the story of Boston, it's the story of Cambridge, but we also see stories where the university hasn't had much influence. Baltimore and Marion Feldman's work looking at the University of, the Johns Hopkins University not having an impact on the development of a biotech, high-tech industry in Baltimore. Or in Cleveland, where people looked at the investments in research and development that didn't pan out for the Cleveland economy, but in fact, ideas developed in the university in Cleveland were commercialized in Silicon Valley. So you have a model of failed high-tech development, even though you had investments in higher education. And then the third model, and that's the model that I'm presenting today, is high-tech development without a university, or just with sort of development of the higher education system as a response of high-tech development. So that's the story of Seattle is one like that, where the university wasn't much engaged in software development in Seattle, but also the story of Portland, Boise, and Kansas City. So what I'm arguing is that in these second-tier regions, we had large companies that played the role of surrogate universities. They created talent, they attracted people that had lots of knowledge, but they developed also people, these companies. They created innovations, and they contributed to entrepreneurship. And this goes back to the argument that I introduced in the beginning, where we have to think about what is responsible for the creation of these high-tech economies. Is it, in fact, the presence of agglomeration economies, like Michael Porter would argue? He would argue that if you have sort of already existing firms and they are in a cluster together, somehow this development bubbles up. Or you could argue it's spin-off processes. It's actually the fact that you have entrepreneurship, and that in return creates the cluster economy. And that's the argument that Stephen Klepper puts forward, where he argues that it's actually the presence of firms and their spin-offs that creates these high-tech regions. And it's not just any firm, it's actually the best firms that develop the best routines, they have the best spin-offs. So you have to look inside the firm, and maybe that follows the argument that we just discussed, and you have to think about what are these firms doing, and how does that actually translate or get inherited into the spin-off later on. He also argues that the better performing firms in the regions attract the qualified labor, and that in turn then creates the pool of entrepreneurs that can survive even in the face of crisis. And then the third argument he puts forward is that entrepreneurship always has a location inertia component. So these entrepreneurs will always stay where they are and found their company in the region, primarily because they rely on the social networks and the social capital, so they don't move. It's a benefit for regions that have high levels of entrepreneurship. So that leads me to the notion that it's actually important to look at the parent firms and how they are structured in this kind of high-tech emergence. So I looked at 3 regions in terms of in-depth case studies, but I also looked at the whole of the United States and how high-tech development is sort of geographically distributed in the metropolitan statistical areas. And I focused on the 3 regions that exhibited some of these characteristics, such as the presence of a lead firm and high levels of entrepreneurship. And if you look at the United States, this is just a map of the high-tech activity by metropolitan area. The very dark are the high-tech centers. I don't have a pointer, but you can see here Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, Seattle is here. Then on the East Coast, you have Washington, D.C. area, Boston, but also the Research Triangle Park here. I'm going to focus on these regions. I'm not going to present Kansas City today. It's a different story of a second-tier biotech pharmaceutical region. I'm going to focus on Portland, Oregon primarily, and then also on Boise, Idaho. When you look at development, these regions, the second tier, are far away from Silicon Valley in terms of size, entrepreneurial dynamics. You know, Silicon Valley is its class of its own. But looking at Portland, Boise, Kansas City, we see there's high-tech concentration going on. They're fairly entrepreneurial. Portland specializes in test and measurement instruments, semiconductors, computers, and software. Boise is a case where it's also focused on semiconductors and printers, actually, with Hewlett Packard. And then Kansas City, as I said, is the second-tier biotech pharmaceutical region where primarily you have contract research manufacturing going on. In terms of these regions being innovative, one could argue it's a story of low cost. Portland and Boise are about 2 hours from Silicon Valley by plane. And they are cheaper, you know, the housing markets are much cheaper, labor was cheaper, there was a readily available labor force in the 50s and to the 70s of women in the suburbs, you know, being employed at the manufacturing companies. But this story would be too short if you just would reduce it to the cost. It's actually a story of innovation. You can see that here how the level of patenting increased dramatically, especially in Portland and Boise here in blue and red, primarily because of the semiconductor industry that's heavily concentrated in these regions. So in terms of Portland Silicon Forest grew primarily as a result of the emergence of two companies, Tektronix and Intel. Tektronix is a homegrown company producing test and measurement instruments, the oscilloscope, and then Intel is the semiconductor company that all of you probably know. This shows you the evolution of firms and also the family structure. So the red parts of the bars are the firms that are associated by heritage to Intel, and the yellow is Tektronix. We visualize this also as sort of these orbiting systems, and you can see the difference between Tektronix and Intel. Tektronix always had many more spin-offs than Intel did. And there's a reason, I'm going to come back to that. We updated the poster with this, so you see there's additional companies coming into the region, but also as spin-offs. So back to the question, why is actually Tektronix very different from Intel? And that's maybe one of the key insights of this case study is that Tektronix has been a very different company than Intel. Tektronix was not only a homegrown company, but it produced different products, and that had a result on the spin-off activities. Tektronix was founded in 1946 by 4 local entrepreneurs, and they wanted to create a company, a small company. It turned out it grew very large to about 24,000 in the 80s. Today it's about 2,500. They created test and measurement instruments. They were heavily vertically integrated. They produced almost every component of the instrument in-house. The vacuum tubes, even the manuals, the screws, everything in-house. They also put a lot of effort on innovation by creating an internal research and development lab. It was like Xerox PARC. The problem with it was that it was too separate from the production and manufacturing and even marketing. So a lot of ideas were left on the shelf. They didn't get commercialized. They were sort of left there. And maybe some engineers took these up and actually commercialized them later. And that's what you see when you look into this picture. Up to the 80s, you don't have much spin-off activity. It changed actually when corporate changes took place, when they got rid of their research and development lab, when they sold a lot of the business units. So the corporate changes really facilitated the emergence of spin-off activity out of crisis. So Intel, in contrast, came to Portland in '76. Intel was never a company that was exploring many areas. It didn't have a separate research and development lab. Instead, Intel was characterized by sort of integrating research with the manufacturing. So they have what they call process development factories. And in these factories, they create some of the newest chips, congruence with the manufacturing process. And you can see here left, it's the newest factory they're building in Portland, Oregon. They're still making huge investments in this manufacturing capacity. Portland now is actually their most important site. They have the highest level of patenting in Oregon, not in California. So they're very interested in sort of connecting the innovation side with the manufacturing side. On the other hand, they also attracted a lot of the suppliers, and in return, by being there, to kind of signal to competitors it's a good place to be. So a lot of the Japanese semiconductor companies came to Portland and set up their operations there. So Intel, instead of being sort of an experimental company in the sense of creating different products, having a research lab, they were really focused and sort of focused on the manufacturing side. It's a very different firm than we saw with Tektronix. There's a similar story for Boise, Idaho, just to remind you where Boise, Idaho is. Boise is home to two companies that were these anchor companies. One is Micron Technology. It's the only firm in the semiconductor field that still produces memory chips. That part was outsourced to Taiwan, China, and so forth, but actually Micron is still producing them in Boise. And then they have Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard came in '73, and Micron opened in '76. A similar story and a similar picture. You have spin-off activity around Hewlett-Packard, quite a bit less around Micron. Hewlett-Packard, like Tektronix, had many different products. It had a divisionalized business unit structure, so each division was its own business. They had to be entrepreneurial, and that kind of led to some of these entrepreneurial processes that we also saw with Tektronix. Hewlett-Packard went through a lot of changes. The laser printer was actually a product that was developed in Boise, Idaho, together with Canon. Nowadays, there's no manufacturing there, it's just software development, marketing. And Micron Technology, just they are in the memory business, but they haven't had many spin-offs, except for one of their business units, which was called, I'm blanking here, they created specialized computers, and it was a very different product. So we see differences in the lead firms, and that kind of was taken up in the case studies, and I looked at what kind of business structures did these firms have along the lines of what kind of industries they were in, what kind of corporate changes happened. So you can see we have sort of the fertile parents as opposed to the less fertile parents. And there's a very strong parallel between Tektronix and HP in terms of their diversified product portfolios really helped the spin-off processes, but also their corporate cultures and policies. In both cases, you had firms that actually took entrepreneurs back if their firm didn't pan out. They had a welcome mat, as it was called, so people were able to venture, but then if it didn't work out, they could come back. They had a strong, on the labor force, they had a strong mixing of engineer and manager, so an engineer could become a manager and learn sort of the management side. So you had the combination here, so that there's, I think, a strong link to who then will become an entrepreneur, instead of the more technical, just engineer focus in the semiconductor companies. So that there's strong differences in terms of the firm organization and culture, and that's, I think, a key issue when we look at entrepreneurship and which companies are sort of parent firms and which aren't. So in conclusion, I think these second-tier regions really exhibit the processes of the spin-off development and how that leads to the emergence of high-tech regions. In both cases, public policy was almost non-existent. Intel came to Portland without any tax breaks. Now they have tax breaks. Public policy in terms of higher education funding only came later. Universities are important now, but primarily in the labor, not so much in the research area. These regions really benefited from dominant firms, and these dominant firms took on the role of surrogate universities. So firm building is a very key process in these regions, and we have to look at a little bit more at organizational evolution and this idea of heritage and what gets translated from a parent firm to a spin-off company. So I think with this, I'm sort of pledging or pleading for a more firm-centered analysis, and then also questioning whether really Silicon Valley is a special case. We've done some work on other industries, and you can see this is actually the industry, the athletic and outdoor gear industry in Portland with Nike, Columbia Sportswear, and Adidas. These firms have had a few spin-offs, but it's a little bit of a different case because we see entrepreneurs coming from other sectors and other industries, and not just from these lead firms that we see here. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to some of your comments and questions.